Good afternoon, Giant 3591, 17-8 descending via the link, and we have Sierra.
591 heavy. There is a little bit of light, well, now it's showing a little bit of heavy, light to heavy precipitation just west of, it looks like, Van, and it is moving eastbound. So once you get in closer, if we need to go vectors around it, we'll be able to accommodate that.
91.
Are you picking up any ELTs right now?
Well, if you pick up an ELT at all ahead, if you would.
Shuttle 690, see if you can make ground contact. We're looking for a lost aircraft. It's 11 o'clock in 2 miles. It's a heavy Boeing 767.
All right, there's Shuttle 6090. No ground contact from here.
We got a 514. See if you can make ground contact. We're looking for a heavy Boeing 767 about 11 o'clock in 7 miles.
Roger.
That episode aired on February 26, 2019, just 3 days after an Atlas 767 plunged into a bay just outside Houston, Texas, killing the 3 occupants. The captain, the first officer, and most unfortunately of all, an innocent jumpseater just trying to go home after his last flight as a captain at a regional and about to start the second phase of his career as a pilot at United. He had finally made it. And in that episode, I told you his name was Sean, and that him and I were CFIs at the same flight school back in the day, and that since then he'd gotten married, had children, the whole lot. His best friend, Jarrett Langley, took a couple minutes outside the door of the hotel room where Sean's widow sat, and he told us about what things were like in the immediate aftermath. But now, it's a year and a half later, and that's about how long it takes the NTSB to complete a formal investigation, and more importantly, to issue a probable cause statement. And boy, did they ever. The idea that a 767 could just fall out of the sky, pretty much vertically with no warning, was weird enough to suggest that this wasn't going to be a typical case. But now that the truth is out, well, the weirdness, it doesn't disappoint. There's a great article out there from Rob Mark at Flying Magazine, and there's a link to it in the show notes just in case you missed it. But today, well, Rob's here in the flesh, and we have a pretty cool talk for you. And it's about more than just what happened. It's about why it happened, and whether or not we can even prevent something like this from happening in the future. And I sure hope we can, because as you're going to hear, it's going to take a lot more than just a few tweaks down at the training department.
But I've had a couple of people say, why don't you get this stuff out sooner? You know, like everybody else has it out, you know, sometimes a week earlier. And I already just assume I can't compete with them on speed, so I'm not going to try. But I try to add some things into it that, you know, sitting back and looking at it and thinking about it a little bit can add to it that the other guys don't have. So at least that's my goal.
Put a little more of the why than just the commodity facts.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can report the junk that's in the NTSB report. And they often are so black and white that they miss, you know, lost control. Okay, great. But why the hell did the guy lose control of the airplane, you know?
Well, that's the best way for a journalist to write an article, right? Just copy paste straight out of the Federal Report.
That's right. But you know what I was thinking is that I didn't see. I'd like to see the. I went into the docket, but I couldn't find what I wanted, which was some of the data from the data recorder. Because I was wondering how far down this guy pitched the nose when he said we're stalling. I mean, because once he got that thing headed downhill. I don't know what they weighed on landing. Well, they were heavy, so they probably close to 300,000, maybe 250, who knows. But I guess when you get that kind of mass headed in one direction, it's not real easy to change direction. And they didn't have much room anyway.
When you see those videos, it looked like he was going straight down.
Yeah, well, apparently that's what it sounds like. I mean, but he must have put the other guy on practically on the ceiling to do that. And why that? And if you listen to what bits of the cockpit voice recorder they transcribed, there doesn't seem to be much conversation there.
The whole thing took less than 30 seconds.
Yeah. As soon as you feel that, you're like, whoa. And you said you knew somebody related to that one?
No, the jump seater.
When that,
yeah, Sean, the jump seater that was killed. He was a colleague of mine. We used to be CFIs together.
Ah, jeez. Was he married? Do you have a family?
Yeah,
and all
yeah,
that,
2 kids.
Oh, jeez.
They're very, very
That's a
little,
shame.
but yeah, I mean, just awful situation that happened. And, you know, the reason I want to talk to you about this is because you wrote such a great article about it. And as I read the article, and then I clicked on the link, of course, to the NTSB's write-up, and they have so many points. Let me see, how many is it here? 1, 13, 14, 20, 23 recommendations out of this, or 23 key points, I guess we should say. And every time I read them, I'm just more and more appalled, and just I don't know how this could happen. You know, I mean, I do, but then when I read it, it only could have happened this way. And, you know, you can use your accident chain model or the Swiss cheese thing or whatever, which I promise I'd never say on the show. But honestly, this is just almost stranger than fiction. But the way this all went down is just, it makes me sick every time I think about it, because it's so crazy.
Well, I think especially when you hear that the whatever was going on, that the first officer's initial response was, "We're stalling." And there were no sounds in the cockpit of anything related to that. We know the guy just freaked because he was flying by the seat of his pants, but and the captain just, he was really behind the game, and that's what's really sad.
All right, well, with that, we got Rob Mark back on the show. How you doing, Rob?
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm all right, except that we're here to talk about this crash that happened back in 2019, February, of the Atlas Air 767. And as I go through the notes here that we're going to talk about, I'm less and less happy. As a matter of fact, my mood is deteriorating rapidly, because this is almost stranger than fiction, isn't it?
I think it is. In fact, just before you hit the record button, I mean, we were talking about how quickly this 767 that Atlas was flying that day descended from, I think he was at 6,000 feet or something, down to the ground. And he must, the first officer who was flying must have really shoved that nose down hard in order to get the airplane going downhill as fast as it apparently was when they hit. And that is just unbelievable, because that's just not how you recover from a stall. But of course, let's face it, there's more to it than just the fact that the first officer, for some reason, mistakenly thought the airplane was stalling when it wasn't. But he so overreacted. It kind of reminded me of that crash we had not long after 9/11. American lost I think it was an Airbus out of Kennedy, where the first officer was flying and over-controlled the rudder, and the vertical stabilizer just snapped off the top of the airplane, and it rolled over. It's kind of like that, and it goes back to those days when you're teaching and you're trying to tell people to be smooth on the controls, be gentle. It doesn't need manhandling. You don't need 40 degrees of pitch or 60 degrees of bank in order to make the airplane fly the way you do. And that's the reason we're teaching people that kind of thing early on, is that we want them to remember those lessons, so that when this kind of a situation happens, they don't freak. But apparently that didn't do this guy any good.
Yeah, well, that, and to use multiple sources of information, and to train your subconscious and your sensory register to be picking up on cues from all kinds of different things, not just the instrumentation. I mean, I realize when you're IFR, you kind of have to trust the instruments, but you still have a cross-check. You're still interpreting from multiple sources, because when one thing goes out of whack, you don't just freak out. You just look at the other sources to get the full story.
Well, and of course, the 121 carriers have had a requirement in place now for, I think, almost a year. It'll be interesting. I didn't see the training records reflect this on the first officer on the 7.6 as to whether they'd been through upset prevention and recovery training. But they, even in that, they're assuming that things happen that people can lose control of the airplane, but they teach them how to react in such a way that they don't lose it. But this was something with the somatographic illusion. Have we talked about that at all? I don't know if we do. Maybe some of the listeners don't know what that is.
No, we're gonna.
But, again, this person just so completely overreacted that the airplane, he put it out of control.
Yeah, well, I mean, a 767 doesn't just fall out of the sky on the intermediate fix or intermediate transition at 6,000 feet just for no reason. I mean, remember how many weeks it took to figure out why it went from, okay, we're cool, we're straight and level, we're going down to 6,000, and next thing you know, it's falling vertically out of the sky into a bay? Like that doesn't just happen by accident. So
no, and that's right. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say, I remembered initially they thought maybe something had, a piece of the airplane had left the airplane, and they had no control or something like that. But that turned out pretty quickly not to be the case.
Yeah, well, just like you said with that A300 crash, the American one, I mean, in that case, yeah, the very important piece did leave the airplane, but in this case, it was a perfectly good airplane. And, for everybody who hasn't or isn't quite familiar with this, we're talking about the Atlas Air crash 3591 that was in Texas a couple years ago. And I'm just going to read the probable cause here because I think everybody needs to hear this before we start. But the NTSB determined the probable cause was the first officer's inappropriate response as the pilot flying to an inadvertent activation of Boeing's go-around mode, which led to a spatial disorientation and nose-down control inputs that put the airplane in a steep descent to which the crew did not recover. But here's where it gets fun. Contributing to the accident was the captain's failure to adequately monitor the airplane's flight path and assume positive control of the airplane and to effectively intervene. Okay, it sounds like the captain's responsibility, but also contributing, here we go, systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry's selection and performance measurement practices, which failed to address the first officer's aptitude-related deficiencies and maladaptive stress response. Okay. Also contributing to the accident was the FAA's failure to implement the pilot records database, which the NTSB had previously suggested, in a sufficiently robust and timely manner. Okay, well, that doesn't sound like a bunch of mechanical stuff happening. Pardon the pun, but that's crazy.
Well, it is really, and this is also reminiscent of the Colgan accident back in, 2009, I believe, the Dash 8 Q400 that crashed on approach because they lost control of the airplane because the captain who was flying the airplane wasn't paying attention, and the airplane stalled as they slowed the airplane down. And again, it's one thing to talk about loss of control, but until you've been in situations where you realize, as you mentioned earlier, that when you're flying on instruments, you really have to pay attention to the instruments if you can't see the ground. But you got to make sure you stop trying to feel what the airplane's doing. I don't mean completely, because we all know that you can hear things. You can hear an airplane slowing. You can hear the noise levels change as you drop flaps in the gear and all that kind of thing. But you can't go by the seat of your pants when you think we're turning or I'm climbing, or you just can't do that because your ears lie to you, your brain lies to you, and we know that. But again, this first officer had proven before that he had difficulty because he overreacted to situations, except that, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Atlas Air knew that when they hired the guy.
Yeah, they didn't. And I guess that's because what the NTSB is saying is the database that may exist or does exist, but you don't have to use or something like that, is not sufficiently in place to where, you can look up somebody's past history. I mean, they could go apply to your company and just sort of omit the fact that they just got fired from XYZ airline for not passing training because they have maladaptive stress responses and kind of freak out when anything goes wrong. And, you get through training, that's it, go fly the line. But had the company known that, then obviously they would not have made the decision to hire and train you, particularly when things got rough in the sim. And this guy, from what I heard, he had to take a couple retrainings in the sim. And I'm looking through my notes here to find the the list of them, but the guy had more than one or two issues getting through training.
Well, and it's reminiscent of the Colgan accident in 2009, and anybody can bust a ride. I mean, it happens. I busted one, and it was not pretty. But the point is that I learned from it, and I said, I'm not near as good as I thought I was, and I deserved to fail that ride. But that's the way most professional pilots would react. But this fellow knew if he was going to get hired at Atlas, he couldn't tell them about everything. And that was one part of the Pilot Records Act that really doesn't work, because what do you do when somebody lies and they lie by omission and just say, I never worked there? I'm just not even going to tell them I was there. And then they won't have to look up any bad things about me. And here we are 11 years after the Colgan accident, and we're still screwing around with this.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look here. I found what the actual NTSB said here after the synopsis in point number 11. Here's the first time it's mentioned. The first officer's long history of training performance difficulties and his tendency to respond impulsively and inappropriately when faced with an unexpected event during training scenarios at multiple employers suggest an inability to remain calm during stressful situations, a tendency that may have exacerbated his aptitude and his related performance difficulties. And then a couple points later here, the first officer's repeated uses of incomplete and inaccurate information about his employment history on resumes and applications were deliberate attempts to conceal his history of performance deficiencies and deprived Atlas Air and at least one other former employer of the opportunity to fully evaluate his aptitude and competency as a pilot. And then the next point is Atlas Air's human resources personnel's reliance on designated agents to review pilot background records and flag significant items of concern was inappropriate, and it resulted in the company's failure to evaluate the first officer's unsuccessful attempt to upgrade to captain at his previous employer. So a couple points later for those that are a little confused on this, and we'll talk about it too, because I'm not as familiar as I could be with the Act, but it says the manual process by which Pilot Records Improvement Act records are obtained could preclude a hiring operator from obtaining all background records for a pilot applicant who fails to disclose a previous employer due to either deception or having resigned before being considered fully employed, such as after starting but not completing initial training. Yeah.
As I said, if somebody lies, you have no defense for that. It's just amazing to me that we're still fussing with this problem. Something that probably didn't help this situation was the last 2 or 3 years of warp speed pilot hiring, where practically every carrier on the face of the earth was short of pilots, and they would take anybody that looked like they had their head screwed on straight. And they overlooked, I bet you they probably just overlooked certain things that I know. I remember one piece I wrote about in the story that one of the examiners gave a big long list of things that this person had been written up for on a ride that he failed near as he was approaching his type ride. And it was just unbelievable. Situational awareness was lacking. Procedures were incorrect. Aircraft limitations were exceeded. Judgment was poor. CRM skills were poor. Steep turns exceeded all PTS limits. Non-precision procedures, that would be non-precision approach procedures, were non-existent, and a totally unstable approach resulted. He didn't work well with pilot monitoring during in-flight emergencies, and a lack of confidence and tunnel vision were definite contributing factors. Holy smokes. I mean, how many do you need in order to say, this person's not ready for this, and honestly, they may never be. But to put them in the right seat of a 7.6, oh my Lord.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a laundry list. And, aside from putting that just all over your resume, it's just unbelievable that that amount of deception through omission was allowed to happen. I mean, you're looking at somebody who's thankfully never crashed an airplane up to this point, but they knew they weren't going to make it where they were, and luckily they got out of there and started flying boxes. But, you get to this point where even there he could barely hack it, but obviously they need bodies in seats to fly the boxes around. I mean, this flight was operating for Amazon Prime Air, if I remember correctly. And, people got to get their stuff. So, I mean, I realize that it's a full 121 scheduled carrier and all of the things apply there. But at the same time, I mean, it's not exactly United we're talking about here. So it's unbelievable, though, that people could be placed in that amount of danger through the fact that somebody just left something off of their employment history.
Well, and that is absolutely the problem, is that this proved again that there's no defense for that from the HR side of things. A person shows you their pilot certificates, their medical. Actually, it makes me wonder if anybody asked or ever saw his logbook, because I think he had quite a bit of time. I think he had flown for Envoy or somebody, which is where he tried to upgrade and didn't make it. But I would have thought all of that would have been in his logbook, but there's really no mention of that in the information that I could find initially.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I guess it just depends. When I got hired in an airline, I had to bring my logbook, not a copy, not anything, but the actual logbook itself. And they spent probably 20 minutes combing through every page of it, every endorsement, every, did you pass this? Have you ever failed this or that, part 141 or part 61? Because I remember when, my flight school that I was at went full 141, it was like, well, you're never going to fail another check ride, right? Because there's no pink slip goes to the FAA from an outside contractor that you didn't pass. It's just, we'll just keep on training you until the chief pilot says you're good. And I realize I don't mean to sound like I'm glossing over the simplicity of that. We had a very, very high standard and plenty of people did not pass on their first attempt, but there's still no pink slip that would go to the FAA. So have you ever failed a check ride? Nope. I mean, you've never been on one, right? I mean, it's semantics at this point, but that was the first time I was exposed to the, I guess, relative ease of hiding something that your future employer would probably like to know.
Well, sure. And have you heard of P51 time?
Yes, I have.
And for listeners who haven't heard of P51 time, there was a ballpoint pen back in the, I don't know, maybe the 70s or something, the something P51. And I remember the first time somebody, I was interviewing with somebody, and the guy said, so is there any P51 time in here? I went, P51? I've never been on a fighter. He went, you don't get it, do you? I went, no, I've never been in a fighter. And then he explained it to me. I went, holy smokes. The point was that people would just put data in logbooks that was just simply untrue. I've got 412 hours in the Boeing 767 on the right seat, and it just wasn't true because there was no way to go back and research that and figure out if that really was the case. And as of this point, there really still isn't. All that they're looking for during an interview is, does your logbook seem to follow a consistent line? Does the story seem to make sense with the progression of your experience? And that's what they're looking for, is something that looks fishy.
Well, even if you had, would you have told the guy? I mean, that's a pretty blunt question for the guy to ask you.
Well, no, I mean, you're right. You wouldn't, but you just think that you've got 148 hours in this type aircraft, but it's all in the same color pen, and it looks like it was all written on the same day, with different dates. And I mean, that's the kind of thing they're looking for. But other than that, these people are absolutely operating with practically both hands tied behind their backs, because there is no way to verify this information. I don't even believe these days that they can call back to an employer and say, hey, what did you think of this person or that person, which is what they used to do. But then all the privacy laws came in, and they were no longer allowed to do that. And all they can say is, this person indeed was employed here from this date through that date. And that is all they will tell you. So that's of no help to the HR person at an airline. So it's not easy to cope with someone that's just going to flat out lie.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've beaten that portion of this pretty hard, but let's talk a little bit more about the mechanics of it. So, for everybody who doesn't know, what actually happened, or at least what we all are pretty sure happened now based on this report, is that as the first officer was retracting the speed brake handle, because remember, we're coming down to about 6,000 feet here on an intermediate whatever, and obviously for those people who fly the 75, 76, you can probably fill me in on this, and I'd love to have an email from you or something, but there's a point during those transitions where you're probably going to have to use the speed brake handle a little bit to slow down, and that's fine. It's, depends on the descent and all that kind of stuff, but that speed brake handle, of course, is kind of, I wouldn't say dangerously, but very close to the throttles, of course, just on the center pedestal there, we know, and he bumped the go-around switch. I mean, that's as simple as we can make this. He was stowing the handle, palm the toga switch. Ruh-roh. Well, we've all accidentally bumped something at some point during our career that we wish we hadn't just bumped. But at that point, that's when your stress response, the startle response, and your general skill as a pilot and human being come into play to fix or undo what you just did by accident, right? But that's not what happened here. So as the command bar is pitched up, and I believe it started adding power, he gets the somatogravic illusion, which is what happens when you have a rapid acceleration and maybe even a slight pitch up, maybe not, but you feel like you're pitching straight up or tumbling backwards, right?
Correct. Absolutely correct.
Okay. So that's going to happen, but it seems like a relatively simple thing to undo if you know what you just did. But in this case, that's not what happened. And we can think here, to take a quick little side bar, captain should be able to fix that pretty quickly, right? Or not? What do you think? Did the captain have enough time to fix this?
Well, again, that's kind of how we began this conversation, was with how far forward the FO must have pushed the control wheel to send this 7.6 down at the hellacious rate that he did. And for some reason, he thought the airplane was stalling, although there were, the airspeed was normal, the pitch attitude was normal. There was nothing visually that would have indicated that the airplane was stalling. And now I believe the captain was, I don't know if he was off radio or what, trying to get set up for the approach, but you would have thought that at the rate that at the angle that he apparently pushed the control wheel over at, it would have practically put anybody not seatbelted on the ceiling from the negative G's. And why the captain didn't drop whatever he was doing and, say, holy, I got the airplane, it is beyond anybody at this point. But why the guy would go from looking at the instruments, my guess is he never even looked at the instruments. He just went with the seat of his pants, and it felt weird. And because if he'd had a pitch attitude in slow flight, maybe they had a couple of degrees nose up initially before the command bars went up, you wouldn't have had to push the nose over very far to recover from a stall. But he just completely freaked. He just lost his mind essentially, and just so completely overreacted that again, if the captain tried to jump in, there wasn't an indication of it. But as you said earlier, the whole thing only lasted 30 seconds from the time they were at 6,000 feet until they hit the water. And that's not very long.
Yeah, when I look at this, I try to think, as an experienced CFI, I've had my fair share of people doing stuff I didn't expect them to do on the controls, right? And I feel like I've always had a pretty good record of not letting that ruin my day. But in something like this, I mean, something that's that violent, that extreme, and that unexpected, I feel so bad for the guy that had to be put in the situation of trying to figure out what the heck is going on and how he's going to fix it, because I think it happened so fast and was so violent and extreme. There was almost no way that any reasonable person could figure it out and fix it, given the amount of time that he had.
Well, and that's why I would like to have been able to find the data on the the attitude indicator. I mean, it normally records that, but I'd like to see how far down he pitched the nose, because you put a big airplane like this in a 20 degree nose down attitude, and you're practically, it would look from the cockpit like you were headed straight down. And obviously they were, but I'm just saying it would, but of course realize they were in the clouds. So there was nothing to see, which is why you have to rely on the instruments to give you the true attitude of what the airplane's doing, and because it can fool you, and but again, we're Monday morning quarterbacking here to some degree, but it's really the overreaction issue that I think is most critical in the discussion, because if you had a student in a 172 where you're trying to do the unusual attitudes thing before they take their private check ride or even their instrument ride, and they had violently pushed the nose down like that, I would have no way said, I know that was a bad morning, but there's no way in the world I would have signed somebody off for a ride when I saw them react like that. Not until I had them probably fly with somebody else to prove that this was just a fluke. Because obviously, as we said before, this first officer had proven this kind of overreaction impulse quite a few times before, and they just, nobody got rid of him. They just kept him going through the process.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's eventually a point, and when I was a check airman at the flight school, I know when I first started, there's probably a couple people out there, and I doubt that they listen to the show, but they would probably like to have a couple words with me, because I was pretty strict on things. I really wanted stuff to be just right before I let them go on to something, and to the point where I'd sometimes have them redo a check ride, and it was probably, as I look back on that now, later on, it was, okay, this is a small deficiency, fix it with your CFI, make sure you note that in the logbook. When it's good, they can move on to the next portion of training for whatever course that was. Now, the one that I was really, really strict on all the time was solo, because all the other ones, it's like, okay, they're going to go solo cross country, or we're going to send this person for a check ride in-house, or we're whatever. I mean, you can fix the deficiency, but other than that, they're good, as long as it wasn't, glaring, of course. But then that one, though, before they're going to take an airplane out by themselves, that's not messing around. I mean, that needs to be about as thorough as any check goes. And what I realized was that people operate differently when they're with different people. You're with your CFI, you're comfortable, it's cool. But then eventually you're going to be with a check airman or a different captain or a whatever, and you're not going to be the same person. You're not going to be the same personality, or in that case, you're by yourself, which, I mean, we all know what that's like. The first time you're out there by yourself on an airplane in the middle of nowhere, you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this. But we need to know that person's decision-making is on point. But when you get to a scheduled airline and it's a training department, things are strict for a reason, because you can't have this person out there in control of an airplane with, I mean, who knows how many lives on board, plus that weighs this many pounds and is full of this many gallons of super flammable fuel and all this property and all that doesn't know what they're doing. And so we've got to draw a line somewhere with, okay, this is a little deficiency. We'll retrain you. We'll get you proficient in that. But overall, you're basically good. Okay, now go fly the line. And okay, no, this is too big of a deal. You cannot continue to work here. I don't think this is fixable. Maybe it is, but not in the amount of time you would have taken, because this is a fundamental thing. And in this case, it came down to psychology. It wasn't just that he wasn't ready to be there. It's that this guy couldn't deal with flying an airplane really ever. I don't think it would have mattered if it was a 152 or a 7.6. Do you?
I think you're right. But of course, too, we cannot absolve the company, Atlas Air in this case, from everything, saying, well, the data was faulty, they didn't know. But I guess one thing that I was a little surprised at when I read this, now this was only an abstract, so it's not the complete NTSB final report on the Atlas Air accident. But the recommendations, if you notice them, there were, I think, 5 or 6, and some additional ones that the NTSB reiterated, because they'd made the same recommendations to the FAA before, but there were none to Atlas Air, absolutely none. And I just thought that was really surprising.
Yeah. I mean, ultimate responsibility is going to be with the company, because if they're able to do an in-house training with a I'm not going to call it in-house, but semi-in-house check ride. I mean, a guy probably comes into their sim or whatever, but I mean, if they're going to be able to do that amount of stuff, then they're going to have to shoulder that responsibility for deciding if somebody should be there or not.
It's very, very odd. But again, this is going to be another one of those Colgan type accidents, an Air France 447 type accidents. What do we call them? Watershed moments where people went, oh my gosh, how could this have happened? And everybody these days has been thinking, well, loss of control, when we hear that as the number one killer, they're talking about those little airplanes, because that doesn't really happen in big airplanes. Well, guess what? It does. And one of the reasons it does is that some of these pilots who started in little airplanes, and we all didn't learn the lessons they should have when they were in primary or intermediate training.
Yep. All right, well, let's go back to that then. Let's talk about primary and intermediate training. One of the things you learn about, not so much in the private, but when you get in your instrument, is all those sensory illusions where your body messes with you. So we took a big sidebar there, but let's get back to the somatogravic illusion. You accelerate, you pitch up a little bit, you feel like you're tumbling backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a 172 probably never gave you the amount of acceleration to really, really feel like you're tumbling backwards. But then when you get into bigger, better, faster, more powerful airplanes, okay, now we got the power to, really make you feel like something's up. So what do you think, Rob, about training pilots for these illusions early on? How can we even do that?
Wow. Good question, because this somatographic illusion that we're referring to right now, it happens more often than people might think. Listeners may be hearing stories about how people flying high-performance airplanes never go around. There are so many accidents because they had unstable approaches. They should have gone around. But what we don't often talk about is the fact that in a lot of cases where the airplane did go around, the person flying it really screwed up the go-around, because they don't practice go-arounds very often. And so people would overspeed the flaps, they'd overspeed the gear, they'd pitch up at crazy pitch angles, either that or they would practically hold the airplane level and never climb. So there are a lot of problems that we've seen in professional pilots because we don't practice go-arounds enough in big airplanes. But now how we would simulate that in a small airplane, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I think maybe you could simulate it. Perhaps you don't do it at a safe altitude, go up to 3,000 feet or something in the 172 and put the foggles on somebody and to limit their vision, and let the instructor kind of maybe follow the student through on a go around, and then kind of add a little back pressure so that they could feel the airplane starting to pitch up, which and let them see if they could discern that feeling. I don't know that would work. That's just something off the top of my head, but I don't think I've ever really heard anybody at a flight school even discuss this other than in the textbook version of it.
Right.
Here's what is happening inside your ears, but even in a simulator, it's difficult to recreate because, as you said, there's no horsepower in a 172. Even a 182, even a Cirrus, that's going to push you so far back in the seat that your ears get a little funny. So that is a tough one to recreate.
That's right. And then this had all been compounded, I guess is the right word, by the fact that they had just gone into the clouds, which also creates that illusion when you go straight into like a vertically developed cloud, or even here in San Diego where we get a marine layer all the time that goes up to maybe usually not more than about 2,000 feet. But as you're descending on the ILS and you go straight into the top of it, or if you kind of go into I'd say the side of it, but you'll get that little feeling of pitching up. And unfortunately, it's sometimes compounded by the fact that, there's a wind change and a temperature change at that altitude, which of course is why the marine layer is right there in the first place. But you'll get that little bit of a pitch change or feeling of a pitch change, but then it's actually going to be backed up with the aircraft usually it stops its descent a little bit, so it almost looks as if you're pulling up too. And I see so many people, and I've been guilty of this myself, is I had to know that was there as I descend to not change anything and keep just scanning and flying the approach. But you know that something's going to change right when you go into the clouds. But right there was the key, because what this guy did was went into the clouds and palmed the toga button, which of course created an acceleration as he went into the clouds. And then both those things, I think, came together at the same time, and he just flipped out. We can talk all we want about how to recreate this in a sim or go do upset training or whatever, but none of that would fix the stress response.
Well, you're right. And I remember I took a check ride in a Piper Navajo Chieftain, and the check airman, we were at 4,000 or 5,000 feet or something, doing various kinds of turns and maneuvers, and he just yelled over and said, "Your right engine's on fire." And I just, my hands were flying all over the place, trying to, get the engine shut down and the fire extinguisher blown. And he said, "Stop." He said, "I've got the airplane." And he just said, "Stop." He said, "I don't care. An engine fire in the air is probably the worst, or an aircraft fire is probably the worst thing that you can have to deal with in an airplane. It is the scariest thing you'll ever see. But I don't care if this airplane's on fire. Take a breath and think about what you're going to do before you do it. Just 2 deep breaths. Give yourself that much time to let your brain settle in on what the actual emergency is and how much of your physical effort it's going to require to deal with it. But don't just react and start shoving controls every place, because you're going to kill yourself and anybody that's riding in the back with you. And that's why I didn't do a great deal of multi-engine instruction, but I did enough in 310s and in the Chieftain to watch people, and they would do the same thing that I did. We'd throttle back an engine and simulate zero thrust, and they would just go bananas. Their hands were like a blur, just trying to solve the problem, because we think we're supposed to react immediately. And even if the airplane was stalling, if that was actually the case in the 7.6, the power was already coming up because the autopilot was engaged and it thought it was supposed to climb. There would be no need to shove the nose down, who knows what, 15, 20 degrees in order to get the airplane flying again. But we're going back to that early training that this man had a reputation for completely overreacting to unusual situations.
Yeah, our recurrent training that we do as controllers, 2 rounds a year, the last round before COVID was a huge section of it was on the startle response and stress responses. And there has never been, I don't think, a great decision ever made in human history when somebody was startled. You think about that when something happens immediately. Okay, sometimes, you think something's going to hit you in the head, you duck. Okay, well, maybe that's a good one. But if something happens like when you're driving and somebody startles you, usually your reaction is overreaction. And then as the adrenaline settles, it turns to rage. And then we start making a whole bunch of new choices we probably wish we hadn't done. But this is how fights start. This is how accidents happen. This is how fires get made worse. This is how a 767 gets shoved into the ground from 6,000 feet for no reason whatsoever. I mean, these stress responses in human beings are very, very robust. I mean, we get scared. We could be prompted into killing something straight up. I mean, it's that strong. But we need to take that second, because we also know that just taking 1 or 2 breaths is going to take that right back out of you. That's how long it takes the adrenaline to subside, and then you can get back to thinking about what you're doing and actually making a decent choice. But when you just make a choice off a startle response, I can guarantee you, I mean, if I had a bet in Vegas, I'd put $1,000 on this. It's wrong. Whatever you're about to do, don't do it.
Probably. Yeah, I'm sure you're right. And again, but if you want to be a CNC operator, cutting metal on a machine, and you screw it up, you're going to waste material, and you may be upset, but you don't kill anybody. But we've all had to cope. And look at how many years professional pilots have been flying airplanes with bunches of people in the back, and it's just something that you must overcome if you're going to be successful. And if you can't overcome this need to react immediately and perhaps overcorrect, we've all heard that. No, you're overcorrecting. But I mean severely overcorrecting. If you can't get that under control, you're never going to make it.
Nope. Before we go, I want to share with you the last couple paragraphs of Rob's article. It says the NTSB issued 6 new safety recommendations following the investigation into Alice 3591, and the NTSB said that the FAA should issue a safety alert for all Boeing 75 and 76 operators, warning of the possibility of an inadvertent go-around activation when the pilot flying is in close proximity to the speed brake handle. The NTSB also wants to see the vulnerabilities of the current pilot record system that would include the results of all pilot training once it begins, regardless of the result, and that system be easily searchable by the pilot certificate number. And the board reiterated its call for advanced cockpit video recorder systems for Part 121 and 135 aircraft. On the human side of the equation, the NTSB reiterated to the FAA the urgent need to require all Part 121 and 135 air carriers to obtain any notices of disapproval prior to flight checks for certificates and ratings for all applicants and evaluate this information before making a hiring decision. And to also require Part 121, 135, and 91 operators to document and retain electronic and or paper records of pilot training and checking events in sufficient detail so that the carrier and its principal operations inspector can fully assess a pilot's entire training performance. The board also wants to see all training records provided to hiring employers as required under PREA and to develop a method of verifying the accuracy of those training records. Well, I'm sure you've got at least one opinion on something you heard today, so if you want to weigh in on what Rob and I talked about, I can't wait to hear from you. Make sure to shoot me an email, brandon@podcastingonaplane.com. Or better yet, you can use your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up when you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record me something, and who knows, I might even put it on the show. And while you're on the website, maybe consider supporting the show too. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You get episodes early and occasionally other fun stuff too. Or if you're not into the recurring thing, maybe head over to buymeacoffee.com/BravoGolf spelled out and do a one-time thing. It takes increments of $3. And if, like me, you're not flying as much as you like to recently and you want to stay sharp on the mic, make sure to use the affiliate code DELTA at plainenglishsim.com to get 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC radio comm simulator around. Link, of course, in the show notes for that too. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes, and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. That's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.